Right. So, hello, my name is Elgin Avila, and I'm the Director of Occupational Environmental Health and Equity at the BlueGreen Alliance. Just to make sure, Abby, real quick, I'm just reading through this, making sure that we're good, right? Cool. I see Harley Nada. Okay, I'll take it. So, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for this roundtable discussion on how to maximize the benefits from Michigan of the new federal investments made available in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law for the building sector. We'll be taking questions from the audience via the Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of your window. The building sector truly sits at the intersection of climate change, income inequality, and racial inequity. The building sector's impact on climate change is undeniable. It's the largest emitting sector in the United States, responsible for a whopping 31% of total US greenhouse gas emissions when accounting for direct and indirect emissions. This sector is also one of the most visible examples of racial inequity in the nation. In the United States, people of color are disproportionately impacted by unsafe, hazardous, and inefficient housing and schools. People of color who are more likely than white counterparts to live in low-income households and in high-poverty communities spend up to half of their income on rent and spend 3 times as much on energy as their white counterparts do. This energy burden is in part because they are more likely to live in older, less energy-efficient housing. That's why investments in improving the nation's building sector are so important. These investments will drive down the emissions causing climate change and take steps to address the systemic racism pervasive in the housing sector and public school system, all while creating local, good-paying union jobs and fighting income inequality. The bill includes key investments for residential energy efficiency and funding opportunities to retrofit public buildings. And we look forward to taking more in-depth talking more in depth about these programs during our roundtable discussion. The bill includes $250 million for the energy efficiency revolving state loan fund and $500 million for the state energy program. The BlueGreen Alliance estimates that these investments, which can go towards retrofitting municipal buildings, universities, schools, and hospitals, which we all call MUSH buildings, can create more than 50,000 jobs over the 10 years. There is an additional $500 million in grants for public schools to use towards energy efficiency, renewable energy, and alternative fuel vehicles. School retrofits would create an additional 33,450 jobs over 10 years. The bill also includes funding for residential buildings, largely to improve energy efficiency, safety, affordability, and particularly for low-income households. This is through the Weatherization Assistance Program and the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. The Weatherization Assistance Program received $3.5 billion in funding towards long-term solutions for energy efficiency, while the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program received $500 million to address these short-term needs for paying energy bills. The Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grants Program received $550 million in bill to directly fund local projects. These grants can go towards residential and commercial buildings, and historically, retrofits represent the largest percentage of these funds. Even with increased federal funding from the bill, the level of transformation in Michigan's housing and building stock needed to address the interlinked crises of climate change, income inequality, and racial inequity will require intention and concerted action from decision makers at many levels. Today's panel is just the beginning of the crucial conversation about what we need to do to prepare Michigan's communities to receive federal support for energy efficiency and maximize the benefits of those investments where they are needed the most. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today's event, State Senator Stephanie Chang. Senator Chang has worked as a community organizer fighting for progressive causes in Detroit for nearly a decade before serving 2 terms in the Michigan State House. She currently serves Detroit and Downriver as State Senator for Senate District 1 and is the Senate Democratic Floor Leader. Thank you for joining us, Senator Chang.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. So I want to thank the BlueGreen Alliance for putting this event together, and apologies in advance for my cold. My voice is not the greatest today, but I'm just really happy to be here. I think this conversation is really important. And I also really love that this event is highlighting the intersection between energy efficiency, environmental justice, and housing here in Michigan. So I wanted to talk about the two questions that I was given, one around the benefits that Michigan communities will see from the legislation recently passed around the supplemental, and then how it will address environmental injustices, as well as a question around the job opportunities that are going to come from investing in energy efficiency. So, first I want to highlight the fact that this bill that we just recently passed a couple of weeks ago, Senate Bill 565, is the result of a lot of work, a lot of really great bipartisan work, and it's very excited about it. It appropriates $4.7 billion, much of which is from federal sources, including the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. So really, really excited about the investments that are finally being made here in Michigan. $515 million of federal dollars will be used for wastewater and stormwater, and $750 million will be used for drinking water infrastructure improvements. And we also know that out of some of our state dollars, assistance to small and disadvantaged communities for drinking water infrastructure projects is being prioritized with $43.3 million. And I just wanted to highlight that because I think it is important to note that in our supplemental that we passed, there is significant chunks that are going specifically to small or disadvantaged communities. There is funding to protect drinking water from PFAS, as well as to replace lead service lines, which is a huge priority for many of us in Michigan. Water filters in schools and childcare centers in areas that need them, to the tune of $50 million, which is just so needed and a long time coming. $20 million for drinking water asset management plans, $43.2 million for the dam risk reduction program, money for failing septic system loan, money for contaminated site remediation for PFAS, and many other things, but did also really want to highlight the fact that we are seeing $50 million in federal funding for residential clean energy improvements, which I know we're all really excited about here on this call. And so this is funding that will incentivize energy efficiency and health improvements for single or multifamily properties, and to provide energy assistance. This is both for owner occupied and renters, which I think is really important. And we know that this is money that's going to go to really good use and create lots of jobs. $20 million for the rehab of certain structural or mechanical repairs, $20 million for activities to stabilize or enhance neighborhoods, as well as $15 million specifically for Detroit, which I'm excited about, to invest in and repair homes, and $5 million for THAW, for the THAW fund here in Detroit, for their low-income energy assistance program. So just extremely excited about all of this major investment that is long overdue in many cases. As a state senator and just as a former organizer, home repair is something that we continue to hear over and over again from our residents. And home repair and weatherization go hand in hand, because obviously for many of our families, in order to be eligible to have their homes weatherized, that home repair is actually really critical. If your roof is falling apart or some other piece of your home is just not functional, obviously we need to make sure that those needs are taken care of in addition to weatherizing your home. So moving to the job opportunities that are going to come from investing in energy efficiency, I'm really excited about the money that is in what we just recently passed. Last summer when we saw huge flooding in Detroit and Southeast Michigan, many families were devastated with just massive amounts of sewage in people's basements, furnaces, hot water heaters, different items that were put to the curb. And we know that these extreme weather events caused by climate change are going to continue to happen. So in the wake of those storms, Michigan Senate and House Democrats put together a bill package around climate resilience. And one of the key highlights of those bills was a job creation program around weatherization and a climate core. So it was super exciting to be able to vote on the supplemental that did include a large amount of funding for energy efficiency. We know that households up to 200% of the federal poverty level face a huge gap of over $1,315 per year between the energy bills that they get and what they can afford to pay. Many homes that low-income people live in have outdated heating and cooling, sparse insulation, leaky windows, or other structural issues that lead to energy waste. And we know that this is also a huge racial justice issue. Michiganders of color are much more likely to live in high poverty neighborhoods with low access to energy efficiency projects, as well as older homes that have many of the problems that we already talked about. And so when we talk about weatherization, what does that mean? That can be improving heating or cooling efficiency, improving building shell efficiency, increasing air tightness or sealing, or other ways to reduce energy usage, including caulking, weather stripping, insulating ceilings, attics, walls, floors, water heaters, installing storm windows or storm doors, and other types of modifications. So all of these things, all of these projects take people, and these are good paying jobs that are going to be created. So we had actually put together a number of bills, my colleague Senator Bayer, Senator McCann and I, around bills to create a stronger weatherization program in the state of Michigan, and prioritize the creation of weatherization jobs in communities where a high proportion of household income is spent on energy costs and in environmental protection communities. And we actually worked hand in hand with both labor and environmental groups to develop these bills, which are still sitting in committee, but we're going to keep pushing for, and included responsible contracting language. So I really wanted to highlight that because we've seen municipalities around Michigan adopt responsible contracting ordinances, which are good for labor and good for all of our communities, to really make sure that the people doing these jobs have the necessary experience, the necessary equipment and skills and qualifications, that they have satisfactory environmental records as well as labor records, and that we're considering workplace safety, workers' comp modification rating, workforce development factors, like how much they're being paid, whether they're getting health benefits, paid leave, etc. And so I also wanted to mention that Senator McCann's bill, Senate Bill 749, would increase the percentage of LIHEAP dollars spent on weatherization here in Michigan. Right now, we spend a pretty low percentage of our LIHEAP on weatherization, and we would love to see that increase to at least 10%. And we know that other states are doing a higher percentage. So, so obviously, these are bills that we're going to continue to push. But in the meantime, we're just so thrilled to have been able to vote on a supplemental appropriations bill that does include a large amount of funding for energy efficiency. And, we're going to continue working hard to be able to continue to move us forward, both with weatherization as well as anything that we can do around making sure our communities become more climate resilient, because we know that the way to do that will also create many good paying jobs if we do this right. So again, thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited about this conversation, and especially the fact that we're very much recognizing how housing, the environment, climate change, energy efficiency, all of this stuff is very much tied together. So thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for that warm keynote, Senator Chang. Hello, everyone. My name is Richard Diaz. I am the Midwest Regional Field Organizer with the BlueGreen Alliance and am going to be moderating today's panel. First, I'd like to take some time to introduce our co-panelists. First, we have Ms. Harley Stokes. She's a federal policy advisor for the BlueGreen Alliance with focus on buildings, health initiatives, and equity. Welcome, Harley. Next, we have Mr. Dominic Barbato. Dominic has worked in the labor movement for about 13 years, organizing AFSCME International and AFT Local 3550 before arriving at SEIU Local 517 Michigan in 2018. He represents school and local government employees throughout Southeast Michigan. Welcome, Dominic. Next, we have Hudson Villanueva. Hudson is a community activist dedicated to building a more sustainable and equitable future for all. A graduate of Eastern Michigan University, he currently serves as the Federal Government Affairs Coordinator for the Michigan League of Conservation Voters. Welcome, Hudson. Next, we have Ms. Danelle Wilkins. She's a leader, visionary, and is a results-oriented thinker. Danelle has demonstrated servant leadership in her hometown of Detroit for 30 years, first by leading the local movement for environmental justice on the front lines, and secondarily, expanding to achieving true sustainability for all. Join me in welcoming all of our panelists. All right, first I'd like to start out by posing the question to the rest of our panelists, some of which Senator Chang has already touched on, which is the state legislature recently appropriated funds from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. What are the benefits Michigan communities will see from this legislation, and how might it address environmental injustices? Let's go to you first, Hudson.
Thanks, Richard, and hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. Stephanie really covered it really well, Senator Chang, but there's a couple other things in the Senate Bill 565 that appropriated funds from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and also the American Recovery Plan that I wanted to highlight. And one of those is $450 million for state and local parks. We know one of the effects of climate change is, increased rains and flooding that is hitting our communities, and kind of investing in these green spaces is a way to help mitigate that damage that we're facing from flooding. There's also $50 million for Filter First, putting drinking water filters in our schools, which we know is so important here in Michigan, making sure our kids have clean, safe drinking water. But other than that, I think Stephanie did a really great job, so I'll pass it to my fellow panelists.
I'm happy to address the question around the benefits for environmental justice communities. Anytime resources are directed at underserved communities, particularly in places like Detroit, is going to be a benefit. Across the board, there are resources, as Senator Chang highlighted, to bring weatherization and energy infrastructure improvements in housing, and that is a benefit for those that are energy insecure. There are also resources around workforce development. Of course, unemployment and underemployment is a huge barrier and impediment in communities, environmental justice communities. These resources can help level the playing field for community and residents impacted by all of that. The idea of inserting resources to improve access to quality water, improvements around job opportunities, improvements around creating resiliency, adaptation, and other things around climate change. All of these options will have a great benefit and impact on communities that are carrying the greatest burden when it comes to energy insecurity, climate change, and unemployment and underemployment. So we definitely are hugely excited about the potential it could bring to improve the quality of life for folks in our communities like Detroit.
Thank you for that, Danelle and Hudson. Very important pieces for us to recognize the intersection between the federal work and the federal resources and the work being done at the state level. Let's go on to a question to you, Danelle. The Justice 40 initiative was created by the Biden administration to ensure that a minimum of 40% of the benefits of climate and clean energy federal investments go to disadvantaged communities. Federal agencies are working to integrate this initiative into their programming through grant applications, programming guidance, and other processes. Danelle, what advice would you give them on how to get the investments to communities that need them the most?
Thanks, Richard. Well, number one, the process for onboarding or accessing resources has to be simplified in such a way that it does not create additional barriers that handicap community leaders and representatives who are on the front line in these communities to access those resources. So resources that would provide technical assistance, that assist organizations in accessing the application process and understanding that is crucial. The opportunity to ensure that those that are representing the grassroots at the local community have some added access, because oftentimes we're competing against major organizations, big organizations that have more human resources and may not actually be in the community, serving the community in the way that many of the local grassroots environmental justice organizations and community-based organizations are doing, and have been able to have a proven track record for those resources. The other thing I think is really fundamental to this is what's considered a disadvantaged community. And there's a lot of discussion and confusion about that, given some of the tools that are being offered to help municipalities, states, and others determine who's considered disadvantaged. And we can't make any assumptions. The tools can be pretty hard to navigate. And also there may be options within the tool to help to identify that doesn't really reflect the true makeup of a community. And that's concerning, because the fear is that once the resources get distributed and all the dust settles, once again, those communities that really are the traditional overburdened communities will continue to be that without the resources they need to actually make changes and improve the quality of life. So I would be very, very careful about involving folks who are able to identify some of those barriers. Be very careful and open the table to ensure feedback is occurring, and that that you're really reviewing that feedback and adjusting the mechanisms for identifying a disadvantaged community in order for the 40% to actually not only hit the community, because they said the benefits will be there, but it may not necessarily get into the hands and make a difference in the way that we think is needed. So those are my my observations at this early stage.
Richard, do you mind if I add a little bit?
Please, I was just going to call on you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So yeah, just to say two quick points. One is that supporting what Danelle said is the Justice 40 is supposed to be, federal investments for climate and clean energy going to disadvantaged communities. So one point I want to make is that 40% should be a basement and not a ceiling. And then the second point is that, as Danelle pointed out, there's a lot of different definitions around disadvantaged communities. So it's so important that, as she mentioned, having a constant community feedback mechanism, because right now we're in this stage where the White House Council on Environmental Quality, who created this screening tool, it's in the beta stage right now. So there's still an opportunity to provide feedback. So it's important that they hear from communities directly that if, for example, if they're not identified as Justice 40 on the tool, that's something that needs to be flagged, because the more data that they have, the better the tool can be, because at the end of the day, this is the tool that federal agencies will be required to use for resource allocation. So it's so important that we get as much community involvement as possible.
Thank you for those good responses, Harley and Danelle. You know, it's important to note that Justice 40 is a relatively new concept, and there's going to be some time for states and the federal government to learn how to best implement this. So very good responses again. Next question. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law provides funding for low-income households to reduce their energy bills, and also provides funding that can go to improving the energy efficiency of public buildings, and in doing so, save taxpayers' dollars. Harley, can you talk a little bit more about those programs and how states can access this type of funding?
Sure, thanks for that, Richard. So there are several programs relevant to buildings in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or you might also hear it called the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act. It's the same thing. And I just want to quickly highlight two buckets. So one is for residential, and as Elgin and Senator Chang mentioned, you have the LIHEAP program, which is really about short-term help. So it's helping with energy bills that low-income households have and need to pay right away. And it's specifically you know, helpful in terms of, or excuse me, let me backtrack for a second. So part of LIHEAP can be used, as Senator Chang mentioned, for weatherization as well. And I think that's going to be really important because there's such a high need there. So right now it's at 15% of LIHEAP funds can be used for weatherization. So that's the short-term help. The longer-term help is with the Weatherization Assistance Program, where there was $3.5 billion in that bucket, and Michigan was allocated $183 million. So that means there's going to be more help coming for people for retrofitting their homes, weatherizing them, and that'll target low-income households and prioritize specifically households with elderly, disabled, or households with children. And because this goes through state agencies, that'll be going through the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. And then the second bucket that I wanted to highlight for buildings is around public buildings. The reason why public buildings are a focus for us, there's 4 reasons, and I just want to quickly highlight them. Public buildings are usually very large, have a large square footage, and they are also energy intensive. They're often older. So for schools, for example, the data point that we have is from 2012. Back then, the average age of a school was 44 years old. So you can imagine they're even older now. And then the fourth thing is that these are public serving institutions. So they serve more than one role. So schools are a place where 1 in 16 Americans spend their day, but they also serve as polling places. They're community hubs. They can be emergency shelters. So these are like incredibly important types of buildings. And so that's why we are advocating for these energy efficiency programs, that they go specifically for public buildings. So I'll leave it there. Just to highlight one thing is that the important thing with these programs, and these are the ones that that Elgin mentioned already. So again, the state energy program, the energy efficiency revolving loan fund, those are programs that are supposed to align with in this case, Michigan's energy plan. So what is in that plan that aligns with retrofitting public buildings? That's an important thing to know going into trying to access these funds. And then also Michigan has their draft Healthy Climate Action Plan, and buildings are included in that. So again, what is in that plan that can align with retrofitting public buildings to access that funding? And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Harley. You are just such a plethora of knowledge. I definitely learned a few things there myself. Moving on to our next question, we have the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law has provided critical resources for Michigan. We've also seen Governor Whitmer work with the legislature in securing the biggest investment in public schools in a generation. Still, We know we need more resources for our classrooms and to make schools more energy efficient and buildings more healthier for students and staff. Dominic, can you tell us how you see the state of Michigan schools and what more we should be doing to support our students, teachers, and staff?
Thanks. Well, I mean, as you said, the infrastructure law combined with ARPA, I think is probably, I can't remember a bigger investment in public sector services in this generation. In fact, like what we've noticed in Michigan for years, particularly, like, I mean, our local mostly represents school employees who serve in a support factor, custodial, paraprofessionals, bus drivers, maintenance, food service. And the story of the last generation has basically been to privatize those and to find a way to do those through the private sector on the cheap as much as possible. And I think what we need to do going forward is kind of rethink that. And this funding gives us the ability to do that in a way that hasn't been possible for a very long time. If we're going to be retrofitting all of these buildings, if we're going to be investing in the infrastructure of our public school system in particular, infrastructure also means jobs in this in this way. And what we've seen particularly in the last 2 years is that we have to look at our school districts as the community resources that they are. They basically turned, during the early days of the COVID pandemic, they basically turned into the food pantries for entire communities, for example. They turned into the Wi-Fi hubs for entire communities. And this funding gives us the opportunity to bring more of that work back in-house through the school districts themselves and invest in public service as something that we highly value. Whereas, I mean, we're only about a decade removed from a school funding increase being tied to willingness to contract out your services to a private bidder. And I see this money, one of the things we can do for school districts is maybe figure out some ways to tie some of these funds into, or have a goal for some of these funds into bringing the work for upkeep of these new retrofitted facilities and school infrastructure back into the district itself, and invest in that kind of public service. So, I mean, it's an exciting time period, and I mean, there's a real opportunity there that we haven't had in, I don't think, my lifetime. So, you know, maybe not even my parents' lifetime, like, which is, it's just saying something. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Dominic. A intergenerational, once in a lifetime opportunity. So thank you for that. Next question. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was a tremendous step in the right direction. As we've heard from other panelists today, there's still a lot of work to be done. Hudson, what are some of the remaining tasks ahead as we transition to a clean energy future?
Yeah, great question, and thank you. And I think Dominic hit it right on the head. You know, we've been disinvesting in our infrastructure for 40 years, privatizing certain things that just used to be held in public trust and in public good. So the way I kind of see it is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was kind of getting us back up to par where we needed to be with our public infrastructure, just making sure it functions at the level that, you know, a society, the richest country in the history of the world, the United States, should function at. But we're also in the midst of a great energy transition where we are getting off of fossil fuels and towards cleaner energy. And that's going to require even further investments. You know, we were all following closely the Build Back Better Act that passed in the House last fall that was unfortunately killed in the Senate. But the good news is that there is talks of revitalizing a new reconciliation package to invest in our clean energy economy. So the job to get comprehensive climate, jobs, and justice legislation is still undone, but we still do really have a chance this spring and summer to get a big bill done to finish the job that the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law started. Some of the major components that we need to see still are kind of tax credits to get the ball rolling in the electricity sector to get off of fossil fuels. But there are also a lot of aspects in our homes and businesses and other types of buildings that need to change. You know, we still have gas furnaces that we need to replace with cleaner alternatives like heat pumps. We need to get rid of our gas stoves and put in convection ovens, and those all mean good paying jobs for the people doing that type of work. You know, there's been a lot of studies on these types of things, and they're not even worried about how many jobs it'll create. They're worried we won't have enough technicians to do this type of work if we get this type of funding. So we're going to need to also invest in different types of training programs to make sure we have enough workers to complete this clean energy transition. So, you know, on the federal level, there's still a lot to advocate for. We need to continue the momentum of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and make sure we finish the job and deliver climate jobs and justice legislation for our communities so we can breathe cleaner air, mitigate climate change, create good paying jobs, and have a more equitable society.
Just to add to what Hudson said, a couple things that we were pushing for in this reconciliation package is we still want to see there was a large chunk of money towards affordable housing that's still very much needed. That was needed before the pandemic, and it's needed even more so now. There was a big chunk of money for school retrofits. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law has 500 million. That's a good start, but the need is so great that we need to see a much larger investment moving forward. And then there were also some really good funding for expanding residential energy efficiency. So it was going towards efficient appliances and also towards retrofitting for not only low income, but middle income households as well. So just trying to put that on a larger scale. So I think those are still very much needed.
Yeah, the investments in build, you know, are a great start, like Harley said, but the need is so much greater, and continued investment is definitely going to be needed if we hope to keep our schools safe and energy efficient. Hudson, I like how you talked about, you know, with this type of funding dollars coming in and the amount of jobs that it can create, that we're going to need to ramp up some of our workforce development efforts. Last question I have for all panelists is, the Good Jobs Initiative is a pledge from the Biden administration to protect workers' rights, improve job quality, and create access to good union jobs, free from discrimination and harassment for all workers and job seekers. How can the money from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law help to make good on that pledge? Let's start with you, Hudson.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the provisions have prevailing wage requirements that'll make sure that these types of jobs are high paying and, you know, will incentivize union labor. So that's really, really important as we kind of make this clean energy transition. You know, there's a lot of organizing to do in the clean energy sector for sure as we make this transition. So when we appropriate these funds, you know, we have to make sure that the right labor standards are set. So I think the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law kind of incentivizes the right type of work. We're not doing what Dominic said and you know, just selling it to the cheapest bidder and whoever can do the work for cheap, because when that happens, we know the contractors are not doing the most quality of job either. They're trying to make the most profit. So when we think of things as a public good rather than a profit-making scheme, you know, we get better results. Our communities have more money in it, and it boosts the economy overall, which we know very well here in Michigan with our strong labor unions and the auto force. You know, those workers making those wages boosted the economy in all directions and created what we kind of know as the American middle class. So more money in workers' pockets is better for everyone, even if you're not directly working on that job. And we need to continue those investments in the future.
Thank you for that, Hudson. Same question, Danelle. How can the Good Jobs Initiative pledge from the Biden administration be implemented, and how can the bipartisan infrastructure law help to make good on that pledge?
Thanks so much, Richard. So I hinted at some of that earlier in my comments, but I will say this, that these resources could create an equal sort of playing field, particularly for communities that are under resourced and overrepresented in unemployment and underemployment. We saw during the pandemic the ugly story of where the concentration of essential workers were outside of the healthcare industry, who needed to be there to keep everything moving, whether it was sourcing, making certain that food and groceries were available, the gig economy, all those things were crucial. Childcare providers and all of that were essential. And the concentration and over-concentration of people of color and low-income people being in those roles was revealed and evident. So resources that would increase wages, that would bring more dignity to the kinds of jobs that are essential to our economy and to our society, will only be a benefit for everyone, including those who need supporting wages and resources to support their families, to feed their families, and to see that circulation of dollars in communities that sorely need it. That being said, workforce development, as an organization that provides workforce training in the green collar and environmental sector, we trained over 700 individuals. A good segment of those people were returning to society, formerly incarcerated, helping them to have dignity and re-enter into society and contribute to their community and local economy is essential. And these resources help to do that. We're fortunate, we've been able to maintain a 92% and sometimes more job placement rate and onboarding of careers in the environmental sector, from cleanup to green up. So within that, we're talking about energy efficiency, solar installation and manufacturing. We're talking about reducing the burdens of energy on very low income folks, and workforce that can make those things a reality. We know that, for instance, when people are not able to pay their electric bills or gas bills or whatever, that's one of the first predictors of homelessness. And we've seen too many families struggle, especially, as Harley mentioned, with regard to the increase in housing. I mean, rental properties, for example, are off the chain. It is something that we could count on in back in the day, in terms of people who weren't able necessarily to purchase a home or whatever. These are the things that boost the economy, that boost people who are at the lowest level. When we address the needs of the least of these, everybody above will benefit. And so being able to focus on investing in very low income, and also where people are disabled or the elderly, meeting the needs of children, school buildings. These are all things that a society, a healthy society, really requires to thrive and to stay strong. The final thing I will say is, and I know we're all on the same page about this, but this is also about improving quality of life and health. So as we know, walking into poorly ventilated school buildings, whatever, increases the chances for all kinds of chronic, disease, such as asthma and other, not reproductive. That's another story. The ability to breathe better. The fact that school buildings, as someone mentioned, I believe it was Dominic, that school buildings are essential services and places that provide services to the community beyond, and a number of public buildings that you or Harley may have said that too, are crucial. So just a few years ago, then I'll stop. When Detroit experienced in 2014 a really horrible 100-year flood. You saw the erosion of highways and freeways. You saw it was the one disaster stated by the Obama administration that year. It was what happened in Southeast Michigan, where we had over 130,000 flooded basements, and it was just horrible. It was a reality check about our experience and exposure here in Detroit and in Michigan when it comes to climate. One of the things that I learned by partnering with the American Red Cross and others to help provide services and resources to communities, that school buildings were essential places for people to go to for safety while they could not be in their homes because of power outages and flooding and all of that. Well, if these school buildings are located in the most vulnerable communities, they are also underwater. They are also, threatened with loss of power and those kind of things. Then where do people go? 67% of some people in some neighborhoods in Detroit don't even own a car. Where would people go? How would they get rescued? How will they get the needed resources if we don't invest with an urgency in buildings like that and other things that reinforces and strengthens our resiliency for climate change? So those are my things. It's like, this is urgent. It's not something we can afford to just sit on for the next 5 years or whatever. We need to do this now. We're gearing up for what summer is going to bring, because after that 127,000 household floods, after the dust settled several months later, 20,000 people still had flooded basements, and they were the most vulnerable. We might be all in the same storm, but we're on different boats. And so because of that, there has to be a sense of urgency and prioritizing most vulnerable communities. And I'll stop there.
Very strong answer, Danelle. Thank you for that. I'd like to give Dominic the opportunity to respond to the Good Jobs Initiative question, which is, how can the money from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law help to make good on the Good Jobs Initiative pledge?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to what I talked about earlier. Like when you're making that sort of public investment, it can't just be a job. Just can't be just a job. Like, it's not an it's not an interchangeable widget, and another thing we've seen in public sector, particularly like in school districts for support, I mean, much like every other place in the economy, we are seeing the inability to, get people hired, a shortage of people applying for the jobs. And it never really, it wasn't really like that until quite recently. And I think people sometimes forget that. It's funny, I was at a union meeting last week with one of our chief stewards who, when he got his head custodian job at his school district, and he's worked there for 35 years, 50 people applied for that one job. In some of our municipal groups, you'd have 100 people applying for just one job. And the reason is they came with good wages, but even beyond that, they came with pensions, they came with good health care, and the story again, like it's no coincidence that during the same time we privatized out the services, we removed retirement. We made it much more difficult for particularly school districts. They're capped right now on what they can spend on health insurance. We made it much more difficult for public employers to compete with anyone, and especially when their budgets aren't that good. So having this funding out there, and finally giving public services a shot at having budgets that could grow instead of shrink, and having people do more with more for the first time in this century is, I mean, it's just, it is one of the sparks that has to happen in order for the Good Jobs Initiative to be realized, you know, because public sector, when it's not funded very well, like there's no profits there to cut into. When it's not funded well, it makes it very difficult to meet the good jobs guarantee, and this funding does it now.
Thanks for that, Dominic. I see we have 2 questions in the chat from the audience members. We'll be able to get into one of them. And this question I'll pose for Harley. Can you estimate the number of jobs that may be created with the MUSH funding?
Sure, happy to answer that. And then I might also answer the previous question if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, Elgin had mentioned this earlier, but I think it's important to reiterate. So the 2 state level programs, the State Energy Program and the Energy Efficiency Revolving Fund, we crunched the numbers, and if that money was put towards public buildings, you could create more than 50,000 jobs over 10 years. And that's not an insignificant number. So that's another reason why we focus on public buildings. But just to go back to the good jobs question for a minute, one thing that we're advocating for at the federal level is essentially we want to work with federal agencies on when looking at the buildings programs, how can you incorporate high road labor standards, health standards, and equity standards to address everything that we're talking about today, right? And I think that there is an opportunity to do that. So when we're talking about labor standards, Hudson had mentioned the Davis-Bacon, or the prevailing wage. So that basement where a wage can be in a certain locality, that's really important. There's also a Buy America provision where a certain percentage of the construction materials need to be manufactured in the US. So that's really good. But BGA sees that as a basement and not a ceiling for these standards. So we also want to see things that there are ways for labor standards to promote equity, right? So maybe that's a community workforce agreement. Maybe that's pre-apprenticeships or local and targeted hire. There's a lot of tools in the toolkit that are high road labor standards, but can also support equity. And then also, and Danelle had mentioned this, is it's not just about energy efficiency, which is so important. When we're retrofitting these buildings, it's also an opportunity to make them healthier. So yes, that means improved HVAC, but that can also mean healthier building materials, because sometimes those materials can be quite toxic. And it hurts the installers, the workers, and it hurts the occupants, right? So we want to push for healthier building materials as well. And then of course, with equity, pushing, helping support the Justice 40 initiative and really pushing that to provide, all that it is meant to provide.
Very important pieces. I'd like to just thank everyone who has participated in our panel today. I think we've had some great and robust discussion from the federal and the state level. As Elgin said at the top of the event, this is just the beginning of this crucial conversation, and we're looking forward to continuing to work together to keep up momentum. I'd like to thank Representatives Debbie Dingell, Dan Kildee, Andy Levin, Brenda Lawrence, Alyssa Slotkin, Fred Upton, as well as Senators Debbie Stabenow and Gary Peters for their support in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. I think our discussion has made clear that while investments in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law are welcome and much needed, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And if we are to truly transform the buildings sector and address the issues of climate change, income inequality, and racial injustice, more is needed. That's why it is so critical that Congress pass a strong budget reconciliation bill. Such a bill must provide a substantial and much needed $150 billion investment into affordable housing and $130 billion in grants and bonds for school infrastructure. Let's be honest, Pre-pandemic, there was nearly 7 million unit shortfalls on affordable housing, which means for every low-income household eligible and in need of affordable housing, only 1 in 4 of those individuals will receive assistance. That is not okay. Additionally, there were 30 million affordable housing units considered substandard due to health hazards such as lead, poor heating, gas leaks, and way more. The pandemic has caused housing prices to soar and further exacerbate the affordable housing crisis. These are some of the issues that a robust budget reconciliation bill can help to address, and we call on Congress to get to work and pass a bill quickly. Thank you all for joining us today, and this will conclude today's event. Take care.